The chamber was heavy with silence until it wasn't. A single chuckle, sharp, dismissive, dripping with the kind of arrogance only power can breed, slipped from Justice Kavanaugh's lips. It wasn't loud, not even long, but it carried through the room like a crack of thunder on a clear day. To him, it was nothing more than a smirk turned sound. To those watching, it was an insult in purest form, the audible embodiment of every time truth had been laughed off by privilege. Eyes darted instantly to Representative Jasmine Crockett. Her shoulders straightened, her gaze cutting through the space like glass. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. Instead, she let the moment breathe, allowed the echo of his contempt to settle in the minds of everyone present. It was in that pause, that stillness, that the weight of history pressed down. The nation has seen this moment before: the sneer of a judge, the dismissal of a woman, the belittlement of a voice that dared to demand dignity. Crockett locked her stare on him, cold, unwavering. Not anger, no, that would have given him too much. What radiated from her eyes was something more dangerous: control. She knew what that chuckle meant. He was laughing not just at her, but at the generations who had struggled to take their rightful seat at the table of power. The cameras zoomed, picking up the tension in the air. Journalists scribbled furiously. And somewhere beyond those walls, millions of people leaned closer to their screens, sensing that something unforgettable was about to erupt. A chuckle may have been meant to dismiss her, to reduce her argument to a joke, but instead, it became the fuse. Crockett inhaled slowly, as though time itself had bowed to her command. Her silence cut deeper than any rushed rebuttal. And in that instant, the balance shifted. The one laughing had revealed his weakness. The one staring back had revealed her strength. Every second stretched like an eternity, the kind of moment that burrows into the memory of a nation. And then her lips parted, her voice steady, her tone colder than steel. What happened next would silence the room and ignite a fire across the nation. To anyone who tuned in casually, it might have looked like another routine exchange inside the marble halls of power. But to those who knew, who felt the undercurrent of history every time a gavel struck, this moment was anything but ordinary. This was more than words exchanged in a chamber. It was a battlefield where the dignity of millions was on trial, disguised as a single argument. The hearing itself carried enormous stakes. Questions of justice, accountability, and the direction of the nation's highest court were at its core. Yet beneath the legal jargon and procedural tone, another story pulsed with urgency. The story of whose voices are allowed to matter in America. Kavanaugh's chuckle wasn't simply a reaction to a point of debate. It was an old gesture, as old as every time a man in power had brushed aside a woman who dared to speak. And this woman was no ordinary challenger. Jasmine Crockett carried with her the lived experience of being underestimated, dismissed, and told to wait her turn. She represented communities that had long been silenced in the very rooms where decisions about their lives were made. Her presence was defiance in itself, but her words carried the weight of generations. When he laughed, it wasn't just at her, it was at the audacity of progress, the insistence that truth be spoken without apology. Millions of women saw themselves in that moment, recognizing the tone of that laugh because they had heard it in boardrooms, classrooms, and across dinner tables. Millions more immigrants, workers, communities of color recognized the power imbalance in the air. This wasn't just one man and one woman in disagreement. It was a contest of symbols, the entrenched privilege of a lifetime appointment versus the raw, rising voice of democratic accountability. The stakes grew higher with every passing second. The cameras weren't just documenting an argument. They were transmitting a cultural clash across the nation. Would the old way mockery, dismissal, arrogance stand unchallenged? Or would dignity strike back in a way that could not be ignored? For Jasmine Crockett, silence was not an option. For millions watching, validation was overdue. And in that tension, the room felt ready to tip into something historic. Because what Kavanaugh thought was a moment of levity, a careless laugh to puncture the gravity of her point, was in fact the trigger. He had unknowingly lit the fuse of a narrative that would burn far beyond that hearing room. The eyes of the country narrowed in. Social media feeds began to buzz, snippets of video looping endlessly with captions of disbelief. Did he just laugh? Did he just chuckle at her argument? The questions weren't rhetorical, they were fuel, and the answers were setting fire to every timeline. But this was still just the beginning. The tension in that chamber had only scratched the surface of what was coming, because what followed wasn't going to be a back and forth of ordinary debate. It was about to become a defining clash, an eruption that would expose the arrogance of one and the resilience of the other. The chuckle was just the spark. The explosion was about to come. To understand why that single chuckle carried so much weight, you have to know the man behind it. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wasn't merely reacting in a vacuum. He was drawing from a lifetime steeped in entitlement, a career built on privilege, and a reputation shadowed by controversy. His laugh wasn't spontaneous. It was the predictable sound of a man who had rarely been forced to take another perspective seriously. From the earliest days of his career, Kavanaugh's path was smoothed by connections and institutions that elevated him above scrutiny. Elite prep schools, Ivy League credentials, clerkships with power brokers, his resume was polished to gleam. Yet, for all the brilliance it promised, his story was never about genius rising against odds. It was about doors that opened because of who he was and who he knew. Each step wasn't proof of struggle overcome, but of privilege maintained. And then there were the controversies, those public reckonings, where the nation glimpsed the fragility behind the polished exterior. The hearings that nearly derailed his ascent to the Supreme Court revealed not only accusations that scarred his image, but also his reaction. Bursts of indignation, tears laced with anger, a man lashing out rather than calmly defending. In those moments, Americans saw something unsettling. Not strength, not composure, but a glimpse of how quickly arrogance can collapse into fury when challenged. That fragility has never gone away. It lingers in every exchange, hidden beneath his insistence on authority. The chuckle at Crockett's words wasn't just an attempt to dismiss her argument. It was armor, a shield, the nervous tick of someone who knows that under the robes of power lies a record that can be questioned, a legacy that may never escape suspicion. Laughter in that moment was a substitute for substance. The contradictions are glaring. He speaks of impartial justice, yet his tone often drips with partisanship. He insists on dignity in the court, yet has shown disdain when dignity is demanded of him. He has held himself up as a guardian of law, but bristles when reminded that the law must be accountable to the people it governs. Each contradiction stacks like a precarious tower, one that looks sturdy until a single push sends it wobbling. And perhaps that is why the dynamic between him and Jasmine Crockett struck such a nerve. He, the symbol of an entrenched system that has too often excused itself from humility. She, the embodiment of voices long ignored, standing unshaken in the face of power. His chuckle was meant to reinforce dominance, to remind her and everyone else who sat on the higher bench. But instead, it revealed the opposite. It reminded the country of every time he had seemed untouchable, not because of merit, but because of insulation. People remember. They remember the spectacle of his confirmation hearings, the raw emotion, the cries of unfairness from a man who sat on the cusp of a lifetime role. They remember how his supporters painted him as a victim, even as others recounted pain. They remember the stark image of a man insisting he was beyond reproach, while the world questioned whether his past had been fully confronted. That memory never faded, and it returned with force in the instant of his laugh. Because the truth is, arrogance and fragility are two sides of the same coin. The louder he tries to project confidence, the more the cracks show. Every chuckle, every smirk, every moment of dismissiveness becomes a tell. Not strength, but insecurity disguised. Not certainty, but a man hoping the performance will hold. In contrast, Crockett's silence, her stare, her composure, these were not defenses but weapons. They exposed his laugh for what it was, an act of weakness masquerading as control. And that contrast planted the seed of his downfall in the public imagination. For every person watching, the chuckle did not elevate him. It diminished him. What was meant as dismissal had become confession. Confession of a man still haunted by the ghosts of his past. still relying on arrogance to mask uncertainty, still unwilling to admit that power built on privilege is power that trembles when confronted by truth. And as the tension in that chamber thickened, it was clear this was no longer about the Chuckle itself. It was about everything that Chuckle represented: his past, his contradictions, his fragility. The stage was set, and Jasmine Crockett was about to make sure the nation saw it for what it truly was. But if the villain's foundation had cracks, what made the heroes so unshakable? The answer lay in her story, her journey, and the fire she brought with her into that room. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that chamber, long before the nation watched her lock eyes with a Supreme Court justice, her life had already been a study in resilience. She did not arrive by inheritance or entitlement. She arrived by grit, by sacrifice, by carrying the voices of people who had been told too many times that their struggles didn't matter. Her story was forged not in elite halls designed to protect privilege, but in the crucible of lived reality, where every triumph demanded a fight. Crockett's beginnings tell us everything about the fire that now defines her. Raised in a world where the odds were rarely tilted in her favor, she learned early what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers, bosses, even colleagues often assumed her silence meant submission. But silence, for her, was never surrender. It was study. It was calculation. It was the gathering of strength to speak at the exact moment when words could not be ignored. Every glance down upon her, every smirk of dismissal became fuel. Her education was not just about books and classrooms, though she mastered those as well. It was about the education of survival. She saw firsthand how laws written in distant chambers rippled painfully into neighborhoods where people struggled with rent, health care, and opportunity. She came to understand that policy is not an abstract debate. It is the air people breathe, the food they can or cannot afford, the dignity they are either granted or denied. That understanding hardened into purpose. When she began practicing law, she did so not with the intent of prestige, but of service. Her cases weren't glamorous. They were gritty. She defended people society was quick to forget: tenants, workers, the accused who lacked resources but not humanity. She stepped into courtrooms where others scoffed, facing judges and prosecutors who saw her as an obstacle rather than an equal. Yet time after time she stood firm, her voice unshaken, her arguments sharp. Each victory was not just for her clients, but for the principle that justice cannot belong only to the powerful. Community became her anchor. While others used their careers to climb into insulated towers, Crockett poured herself into the neighborhoods she represented. She listened, she organized, she fought. She stood shoulder to shoulder with immigrants facing deportation, families fighting eviction, and workers demanding fair pay. Every story she absorbed became part of her arsenal, each one a reminder that when she spoke in the halls of Congress, she wasn't speaking for herself. She was speaking for thousands who couldn't be in the room. She was their voice, their witness, their champion. Her style became legendary among those who followed her rise. Sharp, fearless, unwilling to back down when challenged. But it wasn't bluster, it was conviction. While others sought sound bites, she sought substance. While others crumbled under pressure, she seemed to grow stronger. Adversaries learned quickly that raising their voice against her only exposed their weakness. She didn't need volume to dominate. She needed truth, wielded with precision like a blade. And so when she entered that chamber opposite Kavanaugh, she brought more than a legal argument. She brought a lifetime of experience standing against dismissal. Every chuckle she'd endured from a boss who doubted her, every condescending comment she'd weathered from men who assumed her place was in the background. Every raised eyebrow at her boldness, those echoes sharpened her resolve. His laugh wasn't new. It was old, ancient even, and she had been preparing to answer it her whole life. The symbolic power of her presence was impossible to ignore. In a room designed to elevate privilege, she embodied the progress privilege had tried to suppress. A black woman, an unapologetic advocate, an elected representative of people who had clawed for their seat at the table, she was, in every sense, the antithesis of the man who chuckled at her words. And yet, unlike him, her authority was not insulated by lifetime appointment. It was earned every day, through the trust of those she served. Her composure in that moment wasn't an act. It was instinct. It was what happens when a person has walked through storms and learned to make lightning bend to their will. Where others might have lashed out at being laughed at, she chose pause. Where others might have faltered, she steadied, because she knew the true strength of her position. She wasn't there just as Jasmine Crockett. She was there as the culmination of a movement, as the living proof that arrogance cannot erase dignity, no matter how many times it tries. And perhaps that's why the silence she held before speaking was so powerful. For her, silence was not emptiness. It was history gathering behind her. It was the weight of every mother, every daughter, every immigrant, every worker who had been mocked or dismissed, now demanding their say through her. In that chamber, silence was no weakness. It was thunder waiting to roll. So when her lips parted, when her voice prepared to rise against the dismissive chuckle of a Supreme Court justice, the outcome was already foretold. She had lived her whole life preparing for this clash. His arrogance was fragile, but her resilience was unshakable. And the collision of those two forces was about to leave a mark that neither the chamber nor the nation would forget. Because if Kavanaugh's story was one of privilege protected, Crockett's was one of truth earned. And when those two collide, history always remembers who stood for the people. The question now was not whether she would respond, but how sharp, how devastating, how unforgettable. The world leaned in, waiting for the storm. The moment hung in the air, stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. Kavanaugh's chuckle had faded, but its echo still vibrated through the chamber, a sound less like humor and more like dismissal polished into habit. He shifted in his seat, leaning back slightly, lips curling into the faintest of smirks as though to signal, "This is beneath me." It was a gesture as old as power itself, the slight tilt of the head, the condescending smile that said, without words, "I'm not threatened by you." Crockett didn't rush. Her eyes stayed locked on him, her composure steady, each second of silence tightening the grip she held over the room. When she finally spoke, it was not hurried nor loud, but measured, each syllable cutting with deliberate precision. She returned to her point, sharper this time, her words slicing through the haze of dismissal like a blade through paper. "You may find this amusing," she began, her tone calm, nearly surgical, "but the families who live with the consequences of your decisions do not laugh." The chamber stilled. Kavanaugh shifted again, a flicker of discomfort masked by another thin smile. He raised a hand slightly, gesturing as if to wave away the gravity of her statement, as though her argument were no more than political theater. "Congresswoman," he interjected, voice even, but carrying that practiced tone of authority that assumes the last word belongs to him. "I believe you're overstating." But Crockett wasn't yielding. Her voice grew firmer, not louder, commanding the attention of everyone within earshot. "No, I am not overstating. I am stating plainly what millions already know. When the court diminishes rights, when it looks the other way as communities are stripped of protections, it is not theory. It is reality." His eyes narrowed, and for a brief second the smirk slipped. That was the crack, the moment his dismissal wavered under the weight of her conviction. The tension climbed higher, every line of argument like a step up a steep mountain, both sides locked in a climb where only one would reach the summit. Kavanaugh cleared his throat, leaning forward now, an attempt to reassert control. "Respectfully, your rhetoric." Rhetoric? Her interruption landed like a strike, quick and undeniable. "You call it rhetoric because you don't have to live it, because privilege insulates you from the pain these policies inflict. You laugh because you can, others cry because they must." A murmur rippled through the chamber. It wasn't just an exchange anymore, it was a clash. Each beat resonating with an audience that could feel history being written in real time. Crockett leaned in slightly, her presence filling the space between them. She didn't need theatrics. Her precision, her control, her refusal to yield, that was the drama. Kavanaugh, now visibly stiff, reached again for a tone of calm authority, but it rang hollow. "Congresswoman, the court operates on legal principle, not emotion." And there it was, the line that sounded detached, cold, and profoundly out of step. Crockett seized it instantly, her words like a trap snapping shut. Principle without humanity is not justice. It's cruelty dressed in robes. The air grew heavy, the room drawn into her orbit. She had shifted the debate. No longer was it about the surface-level argument. Now it was about dignity, about who gets to decide which voices matter. Kavanaugh had tried to reduce her to a caricature, a passionate but forgettable figure easily brushed aside with a laugh. Instead, he had elevated her by underestimating her resolve. Each exchange stacked higher, like waves building toward a crest. He dismissed, she countered. He gestured, she sharpened. He leaned on authority, she leaned on truth. And with every pass, the imbalance of power seemed to shift, tilting away from him and toward her. Spectators leaned forward, journalists scribbled, cameras caught every flicker of expression. The clash was no longer just legal or political, it was human, raw, visceral, and at its center, Crockett stood not merely as a congresswoman, but as the embodiment of every silenced voice, finally refusing to be mocked into silence. The debate had escalated beyond what either side intended. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were personal, cultural, generational, and just as the tension seemed to reach its limit, Crockett delivered the pause her silence before the strike, and then the coldest, most calculated response landed. The silence was deafening. Not the silence of defeat, not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of calculation, a silence that belonged wholly to Jasmine Crockett. She let it stretch, let it expand until the weight of it pressed on every chest in the chamber. It was a silence that demanded attention, a silence that said, "I am not rushing to meet your mockery. I am letting your arrogance rot in the open for everyone to see." Kavanaugh's smirk twitched as the pause dragged on. He shifted in his chair, trying to project nonchalance but betraying the slightest edge of unease. The chuckle that had started this standoff was gone now, swallowed by the awareness that he had misjudged his opponent. Crockett's gaze never left him. Her stillness was surgical, a scalpel in the air, waiting to cut. And then her voice. Low, steady, deliberate. "Justice Kavanaugh," she said, the title laced with a cold respect that felt sharper than disdain. "When you laugh at arguments you disagree with, you don't diminish me. You diminish the people who sent me here to speak for them." The words landed like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward, filling the room. No theatrics, no raised volume, just truth, delivered with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly how much damage it would do. Kavanaugh's lips parted slightly, perhaps to interrupt, perhaps to deflect, but Crockett pressed forward, her tone tightening. "You sit on the highest court in this nation, a lifetime appointment, an extraordinary privilege. And yet when confronted with the lived reality of everyday Americans, people losing homes, families losing rights, communities stripped of protections, you laugh." Gasps flickered around the room, subtle but audible. A reporter's pen halted mid-scratch. Someone in the gallery stifled what might have been a gasp, or a whispered yes. Crockett's cadence sharpened, like hammer strikes building momentum. "That laugh," she continued, leaning forward now, "is the sound of a system that has never had to feel the consequences of its own decisions. You call it principle. I call it insulation. You call it jurisprudence. I call it privilege. And the people outside these walls, people who have to live with what you decide, call it injustice." The smirk was gone now. Kavanaugh's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking downward for the briefest second, betraying what the cameras had been waiting for. Discomfort. Crockett had forced him out of his carefully constructed posture of control. The chuckle had vanished, replaced by the quiet, involuntary fidget of a man unraveling. And she wasn't done. "You see, Justice, when you reduce my argument to a punchline, you are not laughing at me. You are laughing at every mother who fights to keep her children fed under laws that don't protect her. You are laughing at every immigrant who dares to dream that this country might finally live up to its promises. You are laughing at every worker who asks for fairness and is told to be grateful for scraps. You are laughing at them, at us, at America itself." The room trembled with her words, not literally, but in the way bodies leaned forward, in the way eyes widened, in the way even the stenographer's fingers seemed to hesitate as if unwilling to break the spell. The courtroom drama had turned into theater, and Crockett was its undisputed lead. Kavanaugh tried to interject, "Congresswoman," with all due respect, but Crockett's retort was already moving, her voice unyielding. "Respect is earned, Justice, and laughter at suffering earns none." The line hung in the air like a verdict. It was the mic drop moment, though she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't pounded a table, hadn't even broken her measured cadence. The drama came from the unflinching control, the quiet certainty, the refusal to let arrogance dictate the tone of the exchange. A wave of reaction surged through the observers. Some nodded, slow and deliberate. Others exchanged knowing glances, lips curling into quiet smirks of vindication. A young aide in the corner struggled to keep her composure, her eyes glistening as if she'd just seen something she would never forget. Crockett let the silence follow again, her words still vibrating in the chamber. She leaned back slightly, signaling not exhaustion but finality, as if to say, "I've said what needed to be said. The rest is for you to live with." Kavanaugh's face told the story his words could not. The flush of irritation had crept into his cheeks. His eyes darted briefly toward the press bench, aware that every twitch, every swallow, every tightened jaw muscle was being recorded, dissected, broadcast. The man who had begun this exchange with a chuckle now looked smaller, diminished not by insult but by exposure, and the people watching knew it. On social media, the clip would later explode, hashtags igniting, captions declaring, "She shut him down." Memes would freeze the moment his smirk disappeared, looping endlessly with text that read, "Not laughing now." Commentators would hail it as one of the sharpest takedowns in recent political memory, but in the room, at that very second, the validation was more subtle gasps, nods, quiet murmurs that told Crockett she hadn't just spoken her truth. She had spoken theirs. Her eyes softened, not with forgiveness, but with a kind of victorious calm. She had shifted the narrative. She had turned a laugh meant to reduce her into a national reckoning. And she had done it not by shouting, not by matching arrogance with rage, but by wielding control, dignity, and the precise weight of truth. Kavanaugh remained seated, his authority intact on paper, but in the theater of public perception, the gavel had already fallen. He had laughed, and that laugh had become the most damning evidence against him. Crockett gathered her papers with quiet composure. Not hurried, not defensive, her message had been delivered, and the silence she left behind was louder than any argument that could follow. But if the chamber was stunned, the world outside those walls was about to erupt. Because once this moment left the room, once it spilled into living rooms, phone screens, and feeds across the country, it would no longer belong to Kavanaugh or Crockett alone. It would belong to millions who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to answer arrogance with dignity so sharp it cut through the noise. And that eruption, those shockwaves, were just beginning to build. It began with a single clip, 10 seconds pulled from hours of testimony the moment Kavanaugh's smirk disappeared under the weight of Jasmine Crockett's words. Someone in the gallery posted it within minutes, shaky phone video capturing the shift. By the time Crockett had gathered her papers and left the chamber, the clip had already begun its climb across the digital landscape. First came the stunned captions, "Did you see this? Not laughing now." Then the hashtags, "Not your punchline." Crockett clapped back, "Dignity wins." Within an hour they were trending. Twitter feeds lit up like wildfire, every retweet another spark carried to a different corner of the country. TikTok edits followed, dramatic music layered under Crockett's calm takedown. The laugh replayed in slow motion before her icy rebuttal dropped like a hammer. Memes flooded Instagram. Split screens showed Kavanaugh chuckling on one side, his expression stiff and unsettled on the other. Captions read, "Cause of death, one cold stare." Others transformed Crockett's lines into viral slogans plastered across stylized graphics. "Respect is earned. Laughter at suffering earns none." But it wasn't just internet humor. It was validation. People who had carried the sting of being dismissed, mocked, or brushed aside suddenly saw their own experiences refracted in Crockett's poise. A young woman tweeted, I've heard that laugh from every boss who didn't take me seriously. Watching her shut it down? That was for all of us. Another post from an immigrant rights group read, "When she said, 'You laugh because you can, others cry because they must,' chills. She spoke our truth." The clip was shared by activists, organizers, and influencers, each framing it not as a fleeting moment, but as a cultural shift. This wasn't just about a laugh, one commentator noted on MSNBC. It was about who gets the right to be heard in America. And tonight, Jasmine Crockett made it clear it won't be mocked away. Celebrities weighed in. Actors, musicians, and athletes reposted the video, praising Crockett's composure and fire. A Grammy-winning singer wrote, "This is what courage looks like. Calm, sharp, unflinching." A former NFL star tweeted simply, "Not a mic drop, a gavel drop." Late-night hosts built monologues around the clip, replaying Kavanaugh's chuckle followed by Crockett's takedown to thunderous applause. Politicians, too, seized the moment. Progressive leaders praised her for embodying the voice of the people. One senator tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett showed us tonight that truth is more powerful than arrogance. We all owe her thanks." Even across the aisle, some admitted unease. A conservative columnist wrote grudgingly, "It was not Kavanaugh's best moment. He underestimated her, and it showed." But the loudest validation didn't come from elites. It came from ordinary people, millions of them, who flooded the digital town square with their stories, each tethered to the moment Crockett reclaimed dignity from mockery. A mother posted a video of herself in tears. "I don't usually watch hearings, but when she said he was laughing at us, I felt that. I felt seen." A young immigrant wrote, "I've been laughed at for my accent, my name, my dreams. Tonight I saw someone answer that laugh with power. Thank you, Jasmine." The ripple effect spread offline. Protesters carried signs quoting her words outside courthouses. Coffee shop conversations replayed the scene like it was last night's biggest game. In barbershops and church basements, people nodded, retelling the story as if it belonged to them personally because, in a way, it did. Crockett's voice had carried theirs. For Kavanaugh, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Editorials dissected the exchange, calling it a turning point in his public perception. Headlines read, "The laugh that backfired." Cartoonists sketched him shrinking under Crockett's stare. Even some allies privately admitted the optics were disastrous. A Supreme Court justice chuckling at an elected representative, only to be silenced by her cold precision. Yet for Crockett, the aftermath was not just applause, it was elevation. Overnight, she became more than a congresswoman. She became a symbol. Commentators described her as the people's advocate, the voice of the unmocked. Her words were played on repeat in classrooms, in organizing meetings, in viral motivational reels. Millions felt that she had not simply argued, she had vindicated them. She had taken the laugh they knew too well and turned it into a moment of reckoning. The validation was palpable, emotional, electric. It wasn't just that she had shut him down. It was that, in doing so, she had lifted countless others up. But this wasn't the end of the story. Because while the nation celebrated Crockett's composure and courage, the question loomed, what lasting change would follow? Could a single moment, one laugh, answered by one voice, reshape the balance between arrogance and dignity? The explosion had erupted online, but the true test was whether its fire would endure. And in the coming days, as commentary deepened and reflections poured in, it became clear this moment was destined to become more than viral. It was about to crystallize into a lesson, a moral, a truth larger than the chamber where it began. In the days that followed, when the laughter had been replayed and the clapback immortalized, Jasmine Crockett stepped into a different kind of spotlight. Reporters asked her about the moment, about the stare, about the line that silenced a justice. She did not boast. She did not gloat. Instead, she reframed it not as a personal victory, but as a lesson. "This isn't about me," she told a crowd gathered in her district. "It's about who gets to be heard in this country. It's about whether dignity or arrogance will define our future." Her words struck deeper than the clip itself. because what she had demonstrated was not just the triumph of one person over another, but the triumph of values over vanity. Where arrogance had tried to dismiss, dignity had endured. Where privilege had leaned on insulation, service had spoken with clarity. She reminded the nation that power without humility is brittle, but truth grounded in community is unbreakable. And people believed her, because they had seen it with their own eyes. They had witnessed a justice laugh and a congresswoman respond. And in that exchange they saw a mirror of the larger American struggle. Who are we? A country that mocks the vulnerable, or a country that lifts them up? A country that excuses arrogance, or one that rewards service? Crockett's words answered without needing to spell it out. In that room, she said, her voice carrying like a hymn, the power of truth spoke louder than the highest bench. The line rippled across the nation, replayed on nightly news, quoted in sermons and speeches. It became more than commentary. It became a creed. Teachers wrote it on whiteboards, activists painted it on posters, parents repeated it to their children as proof that integrity still had a place in American life. And in that moment, Crockett's story fused with something larger, the timeless rhythm of American progress. Each generation has its battles, the marchers facing dogs and hoses, the dreamers fighting deportation, the workers demanding dignity on the picket line, and now a congresswoman standing her ground against the smirk of a justice. Different arenas, same struggle, the assertion that dignity is not negotiable. The crescendo of her message was not anger but inspiration. She urged Americans not to let cynicism win, not to believe the lie that power always belongs to the privileged. She reminded them that every laugh meant to silence could be answered with truth, and every dismissal could be transformed into affirmation. For progressives, immigrants, women, and working-class families, her words were a balm, a validation. They felt not only seen but carried, their dignity defended in real time. And even for those who did not share her politics, there was something undeniable in the grace with which she had met mockery, not with rage, but with resolve. The aftermath of that moment was not just hashtags and headlines. It was belief. Belief that arrogance could still be checked. Belief that truth, spoken plainly, could pierce even the loftiest of chambers. Belief that service to community carries more weight than privilege preserved. And so the moral crystallized, not as a lecture, but as a lived example. Dignity is greater than arrogance. Service is greater than privilege. Truth, though quiet, will always outlast mockery. As Crockett herself concluded in one of her speeches, "You can laugh at me. You can laugh at us. But you cannot laugh away justice. You cannot laugh away truth. And you cannot laugh away a people determined to be heard." It was not just a resolution. It was a call to remember who we are. A reminder that the fight for dignity is not confined to courtrooms or hearing rooms. It belongs to every kitchen table, every workplace, every classroom where someone refuses to be dismissed. The story was no longer about a justice and a congresswoman. It was about America itself, standing at a crossroads between arrogance and dignity. And millions knew, deep in their bones, which path they wanted to walk. Justice Kavanaugh may have begun with a chuckle, but he ended with silence. And in between, Jasmine Crockett delivered a response so cold, so calculated, that it transformed a fleeting laugh into a national reckoning. What began as arrogance was answered with dignity. What started as mockery was turned into truth. And in that chamber, the balance of power shifted not because of a robe, but because of resolve. This is why moments like these matter. They are more than political theater. They are reminders of who we are and who we can be. When arrogance tries to laugh away accountability, when privilege tries to reduce service to a punchline, it is voices like Jasmine Crockett's that remind us. Dignity cannot be mocked into silence. It always rises. And here's the truth: her response wasn't just for that room. It was for every person who has ever been brushed aside, every immigrant who has been told to wait their turn, every worker told their struggle isn't serious, every woman who has been laughed at when she dared to speak with conviction. In her words, millions heard themselves. Millions felt vindicated. Millions remembered that justice still speaks. So here is your call. If you believe dignity always wins, share this moment. Let the world see what happens when truth stands unflinching against arrogance. Spread it. Replay it. Let it ripple into every corner of the country. And if you want to keep seeing stories where dignity triumphs over mockery, where truth triumphs over privilege, subscribe. Join this community that refuses to be silenced, that refuses to look away, that believes justice belongs to all of us because the fight isn't over. But as Jasmine Crockett proved, it's one we can win.